Hello, welcome back. This is a podcast about studying the Bible. It's not a podcast about you just listening to me. It's about studying the Bible for yourself, and then I add my opinions, my commentary, stuff I've learned, and we can discuss it. I will say this because it's completely pointless, and the people that are going to do it aren't going to listen to me anyway, but for legal reasons, I want to explain that when you attack me because of something you take out of context, I don't care. So I'm not going to hire a lawyer. We're not going to talk about it. But if you use good language and you want to discuss it respectfully, I will absolutely do it. I'm doing that now with a guy that I've never even met, but he's not calling me names. He's not saying I'm a heretic, and he's not going to other people to tell them what I'm saying is bad. He came directly to me, and we've had an amazing discussion. So that's how I want to do it. I want to learn the Bible. I want to learn what God said, and I want to learn that with other people. Uh, I have become very jaded against experts or certain titles of people. So a few years ago, I decided to go back to the actual word and study it, learn a little bit of Hebrew, learn some context, and then figure it out. That was my goal. And now I'm sharing that. That's what this is all about. You are welcome to join on Substack at brandoncunningham.com, and this will come to your email or your app every day or whenever I publish it. As we all know, that can get a little flaky too, but excuse me. You can give, but you don't have to. It's completely free, but you can also watch it on YouTube if you want to see me. But we're on Spotify, Apple Podcast, every other thing that you probably get podcast on, we're there. So share this with your friends and tell them about it, and maybe they'll join and learn more about God. It's not about me, it's about God. So that's our goal. Today we are going to cover Deuteronomy chapter 2 and 3. And these are the reason we're combining them, because these are basically, not completely, but to some extent, a restatement of where they had been. Because remember, Moses is teaching a younger generation that no one over 58 is in this crowd, because they had all died out prior. Anyone under the age of 20 lived, and everybody older died. So you got to go back to a previous one to figure that one out if you didn't already know that. You hadn't been with us from the beginning. So we're not going to read every bit of it. We're just going to I'm going to highlight some things, and then we will wrap up chapters 2 and 3. It starts out with verse 1 in chapter 2. It says, "Then we turned around and headed back across the wilderness towards the Red Sea, just as the Lord had instructed me, and we wandered around in the region of Mount Seir for a long time." So I've always thought that if I ever wrote an autobiography, it would at some point would include that line. Then we turned around. I turned around and I wandered in the desert for a long time until I finally started to listen. Most people, I think, feel like that. We don't feel adequate. We don't feel like we can accomplish something. And just remember, everybody else feels that way too, to some extent. But remember what God says about us. Had they remembered it and believed it, they would already have been in the promised land by now. But they did not. So I'm going to let you read the entirety of chapter 2 yourself and 3, and then I'm just going to kind of point out a few things as we go. So the beginning of the war really mirrors Egypt. The king was offered peace. He refused, and so he attacked Israel. The result, obviously, was their annihilation. So the effect of stiffening Sihon's will is that God had him marked for destruction. Once he had decided that in his heart he wasn't going to do anything, God marked him for destruction. The New Testament says that a person who resists God's redemption will, at God's discretion, be permanently left to his wicked state. So there are limits and boundaries to free will. The law of Harem, Herem, is central to a holy war. It basically means that it is a holy war and all the spoils go to God. So that's what the law of Haram means. I'm like, well, why do I need to know that? We're gonna see that as we go forward. I promise. So, for instance, it was Jonah's will to flee in the book of Jonah. There are forces within us that are mysterious. His will was to flee, but God turned him around using that will. And Paul even writes, "When I want to do right, I do evil. For I delight in the laws of the Lord deep inside my inmost self, but I see in my body parts another law that is at war with the laws of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin, which dwells in my flesh." Haven't you all felt that way at some point or another? I know I feel that way I'm like, I know what's right and wrong. Why am I choosing not to do that? Well, that is the forces of evil in my flesh. So King Sihon knew his army was no match, yet he had pride. He was very stubborn. So the king did exactly what Jehovah wanted him to do. He played a part. He had already stiffened his mind, so God used him to forward his plan. God's plan's not going to be stopped because we want to stop it. He will either use us to forward his plan or use us to forward his plan. That's the way that works. So verse 12 says that, or explains that the area Edom occupied was populated by Horites, Horites. The reason descendants of Esau were there is because the Lord gave that land to Esau as an inheritance. Remember back earlier in the Torah when we studied that. So there is a precedent to Jehovah assigning land to nations, non-Hebrews, not just to Israel. So I don't know if you knew that or not, but God assigned certain land to certain peoples. He did that. So verse 20 tells us that the Ammonites displaced the Zamzummim. I have no idea if I'm saying that right. So it means the people whose speech sounds like a buzzing of bees. So it means that their manner of speech was just kind of odd. Basically, if you're not from Texas, you speak weird. That's just the way we see it. And the Hebrews were no different. You speak different than me, and it kind of sounds like a bee buzzing. So it's not really that complicated or deep. That was just their impression. So after all of this, the order is given to charge. The first words of verse 24 are a war cry. It says up or arise. And a few words later, it says begin the occupation. Now we get a list of the people that they are to fight against. So some of that's listed. And I'm not saying it's not important. It's just not relevant to our study right here. But you absolutely should read it because you're going to see some of those names in the in following books and the rest of the Bible. So that's basically chapter 2. Now, chapter 3 is the same thing, and not the same thing, but basically a continuation. The first third of it is just a repeat of Numbers 21, which we studied earlier about the victory over Og. Moses is speaking to the second generation of the Exodus. So they were under 20, most small kids, so they wouldn't have understood some of this stuff. So he's repeating it for their benefit. The reason we read the Bible every day is for our benefit. So we keep reminding ourselves of what God says because the world all day, every day is reminding us of what it thinks. We need to make sure God speaks louder and more often than the world. So some of the details, emphasis, and presentation are a little different because the circumstances are different. So don't get too caught up in Numbers 21 and Deuteronomy 3 being a little different. It's okay. It's also years later, 38 years later, so to some extent. So the towns had metal gates, roads, armies, and a sophisticated government. This was not just like the Wild West. So in verse 8, we get a summary of all the territory seized by Israel, and it begins at Mount Hermon, Hermom. And I've actually been there. That's a pretty cool. Get you a map so you can see where that is. King Og was the last of the Rephaim, that race of evil large men. So King Og's bed is said to be 13 to 14 feet long and 6 feet wide. That's a pretty big bed. So Jair and Machir, Makhir, were the dominant clans of the tribe of Manasseh. So the term son in Hebrew is Ben, Ben. So the meaning is land is given to Yair ben Manasseh. So that's Jair, son of Manasseh. Occasionally, son refers to a direct male offspring, but the Ben Gurion Airport is the central airport in Israel, and it means son. You know, Ben Gurion was the former prime minister of Israel. So Israel was to act as a group or a congregation, an assembly, if you will. The God principle is central for all God's people. We have to act together. I was telling somebody today, I've been attacked by atheists, Muslims, all kinds of people. I'm sorry, I've never been attacked by those people. Every time somebody attacks me, they're a Christian. It's always a church person. You know, atheists don't care anything about us. The Muslims, for the most part, anyway, with me, have never had an issue. Jews, none of that. But Christians have no problem. We don't work together very well. So verse 26 begins a plea to change his mind, to get God to let him go into the promised land. So Moses says it was because of the general leadership that he sinned in such a way as to be barred from entering Canaan. His argument is that Israel provoked him. The Lord says, enough. Never speak to me about that matter again. Not even God's mediator could be saved from the penalty. So if you think about it, Jesus, you got God, then you got Jesus, and then you got Moses just below Jesus because he was God's first mediator, spoke as God. It wasn't divine, definitely not saying that, but he was essentially, next in line to some extent, and he couldn't negotiate his way out of it. God said, no, I've decided it's done. And this is just my opinion, but I think had he said, the reason I'm barred is because I was disobedient, God might have changed his mind. But instead, he said it was because of all of y'all. So remember, when we start an explanation to God as to why we did something, well, she said this and he did that. I have kids and grandkids. Every time the conversation starts like that, I'm like, I'm out. I don't want to. I'm just like that. I'm like, don't talk to me about this anymore. Because if you're not willing to take responsibility for your own actions, I'm not going to discuss whether I should change my mind or not. It needs to start there. A good apology starts and does not end with but. If it ends with, I'm sorry, but, you're probably already in trouble. So let's see here. So the Lord's requirements of his leaders are non-negotiable. That scares me because I'm one of his leaders. But just as in the penalty for sin and rebellion, there's no option. God said it and we disobeyed. So it's clear that's what's happening. Now, I'm not talking about salvation. I'm talking about, do you suffer penalties for stuff because of your own actions? Yeah, absolutely. So this chapter ends with Moses saying, I am a sinner and death is my reward. Therefore, Joshua is now your leader appointed by God, and Joshua became the head of the military, but not a replacement mediator. And that's going to become more important as we move forward. But that's chapter 3. And next time we'll start chapter 4. And chapter 4 is a really great chapter. It's the stake, if you will. And we start to really get into some cool things that Moses is teaching us and that God wants us to know, even though we're not Israelites. So I'm not asking anybody to become an Israelite or a Jew or a Hebrew. I'm saying if we're grafted into those covenants, let's explore them a little further. So God bless. Love God, love people, change the world.